What's up, everyone? In this video, we're going to go from this shed that's vulnerable to the weather to this beauty who's watertight and sealed. Stick around and find out.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Alright, so we're going to start by putting this drip edge at the lower edge of the roof. You'll see me struggling with the wind a lot in this video. Probably not the best day to do roofing, but sometimes we don't really have a choice. We gotta go with the flow. I did put the drip edge a little too tight to that wood framing or your fascia board. You want to leave a little bit of a gap. Also, you can see me hammer my screw before screwing it in. That pokes a hole in the metal and just makes it a little easier to get that screw driven. Also, with it being so windy, it kind of messed up my audio, so I had to use some software to get the wind out. So I did use a little more music in this video to kind of cover up the thinness of the audio. I put screws every, 10 to 12 inches or so. And when I spliced that second piece in, I slid it in like a couple of inches. This is ice and water shield. You don't necessarily have to use ice and water shield, you can use tar paper. But I don't plan on putting any shingles down. Nobody's gonna really see this. I have a garage to my right, I got a garage right behind my property, so nobody's really looking at this. The ice and water shield is self-adhesive. And it was a little too cold to be installing ice and water shield, but you'll see later I use a heat gun. This is my camera setup right now, considering it was so windy. I zip tied it to my baker scaffold, so if it's a little shaky, that's why. Here I'm marking the length. I want to overhang the edge of the shed a couple of inches, and I'll cut it back later on when my fascia boards go on. Right now I'm just gently scoring the back, just the paper, because I'm going to peel the paper off the ice and water shield, but I don't want to peel the paper off the edge because I'm not ready to stick the edge yet, so I left the paper on the edge, as you see here. I like to align my ice and water shield where it's going to go and then unstick it at a 45-degree angle. Just seems to work for me, considering I'm alone. Some people like to unstick the whole thing and stick it down at once, whatever works for you, but this happened to work for me. You want to pull it tight. You don't want any air bubbles in there. And then stick it down as you go. Pull a little bit of paper. Sticky, sticky. Pull it tight. Rinse and repeat. Crawl around on your hands and knees like a little baby and stick it all down the best you can. There is tar on the edges, and the sun will naturally kind of heat everything up and mend it all together, but it was pretty cold, so that's when the heat gun comes in. I'll bust out the heat gun once all the ice and water shield is down. The manufacturer recommends installing this product at 40 degrees Fahrenheit or higher. You want to overlap your layers a few inches. There's a line for you to follow to make it easier. You always start at the bottom and work your way up the roof. The best way to think of it is like a water droplet. You want the water to flow from the top of the roof to the bottom of the roof without working its way into any seams. I've never really done any roofing like this before, but I watch a few videos on YouTube, so I am a certified professional. There is a couple of wrinkles right there. That's what you want to try to avoid. But you can peel it up and stick it back down until you get it nice. It's actually easier if you remove the paper downwards to the lower side of the roof. I was just kind of in the groove here, pulling the paper up to the higher side. I probably should have been pulling the paper the other way, down to the lower side. But it's kind of the same difference. This chalk line is where the edge of my trim will be. It gives me some guidance as to where my pieces should end. I put a small piece on the corners first, so when I wrap my other pieces around like a present, this edge won't be bare. I'll show you a close-up of how the layers come together in a bit. Think like water drop. I'm realizing this will be easier to start from the top, so this line marks where my pieces should start. Maybe wrapping this underside was a little overkill. I'm not really sure, but I ended up wrapping it anyway. It would have been better to wrap this thing in one long piece, like I did on top, but I couldn't think of a way to do that by myself. So I am just using these little strips, and it seemed to work just as good. Later, this siding panels will go underneath and cover all this up. This is how that corner should look when it's all wrapped. Here I'm using the heat gun to get these pieces to stick to each other a little better. This is a cheap heat gun. It's probably like $25, $30 at the big box store. Now I'm putting one last piece, and it's going to wrap over that front edge, maybe like 3 inches or so. make a small cut up to the corner, wrap the side, then wrap the top over. Now I'm going around the whole roof here, hitting it with that heat gun, make sure that tar is all sticking down properly, getting that adhesive nice and sticky. I'm going around to every edge and every seam and just making sure it's stuck down really good. This might be a little overkill as well, but it was pretty cold this day. I was leaving for the day, so I put this 2x4 over the edge just to protect it, keep it from ripping off. I'll come back tomorrow and finish her up, put some fascias on. Alright, it's the next day. It's even colder than it was the day before. Now I'm sticking those sides down, and I'm using this piece of board here to mark where I should cut everything. You don't want this hanging out from underneath your fascia, so cut it back to wherever it's got to be. To keep my cord from pulling, I make like a little loop and hang it on my fascia. This way it gives me a little bit of slack, so I'm not fighting with the cord. Right there, a bug just flew in my mouth. Alright, so there I have that seam between those two pieces of siding. I want to make sure my ice and water shield is hanging over that seam. I don't want water getting behind that because it could potentially rot. It probably would have been better to design everything so the siding goes up to the top of that roof piece, so I wouldn't even need this seam right there, but it is what it is. You know, we learn from our mistakes, and I had to get crafty with it to cover that seam up. You'll see. I had to use a little bit of a thicker piece of fascia board right there to cover up that ice and water shield and the seam. So I used a piece of fascia in the front. It's 7 1/4 inches. I think it's a 1x8 fascia. Comes at 7 1/4. But if I use that all the way down the side, it would have hit the trim over my door. So I made a transition between 7 1/4 and 3.5 inch piece of fascia board. And that's what I'm doing now. I'm using a little sacrificial piece to kind of figure out where everything's going to lay out. Again, I don't know if this is necessarily the right way to do this, but it ended up looking like a finished product, so nobody's really going to ask questions. Turned out alright. I ended up going with a PVC, like plastic kind of fascia. I guess it holds up to the weather much better. It wasn't too much more expensive, so I just kind of went with it, instead of going with pine or something that could rot in a couple of years. This was the hardest part, is cutting that piece between the gap in those two trims right there. I kind of stared at it for a few minutes, but just marking it all out, how it should look, marking the edges, went to the saw, made a few cuts, came back, marked a few more pieces. Scored the back edge so it's not overhanging the top, cut some more and came back. Here I'm using my little track saw jig to get a nice crisp straight line on this fascia board. And my blade wasn't set deep enough. Don't do that. Using white coated nails, and you want to make sure you're using a hammer with a flat edge. If you have a hammer with a waffle edge, it will kind of mar your PVC and you'll see like that waffle design. So make sure you have a flat hammer when you're using nails. I probably should have removed the plastic coating before the nails went on, but it ended up being alright. This piece of fascia actually ended up being like 2 inches short. You can't really see it from this angle, which is why I didn't change it or replace it. I just kind of went with it. But once you get around to that back corner, you can see it's a little short. It's because I had to cut a little piece off for my sacrificial piece to kind of line everything, and I ended up cutting too much off. I cut like 4 inches off from my sacrificial piece, and it was just too much. And I didn't want to order a whole new fascia board just so I could have a sacrificial piece. It's alright though. No one's really gonna notice. I'm not actually hitting those nails 3 times each. It's just, that's the power of editing. Here you can see it's like an inch too short, but you're never really gonna notice it. Here I'm making like a holder to hold my front fascia, because I am alone. If you have 2 people, it's obviously a lot easier, but being alone, you gotta get crafty sometimes and figure out how to hold things by yourself. This 2x4 up there is just to add a little weight to it so nothing moves. And now it's beginning to snow. I would have kept working, but didn't want my camera to get wet, so packed it up. We'll come try again tomorrow. So with all that ice and water shield wrapped around the corners, there was a little bit of gaps. Like if I would have just nailed this front fascia on the way it is, it would have a big bow in it. It would have been much tighter in the middle than it is on the edges. So I start by nailing the edge, both edges, and then I use plastic shims, like wedge shims, in between the middle just to kind of straighten everything out. Here I'm eyeballing it. It's got a little bit of a bow to it. Now I'm getting some shims in there. put 2 nails like every 16 inches or so. I think I put 2 or 3 on either edge where it ties into the other fascia. Never done a fascia board before, but I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. Now I'm cutting the shims with a knife. Alright, so now it's time to put my siding on the underside of this overhang here. I put a nail just to hold it in place, and then I put a couple of screws. I put 2 into every stud, and that should be enough. Cutting those shims back. It's a little sacrificial piece so I could figure out my front trim. I'm cutting a bit of a bevel into the top edge of this trim so that it can sit real tight up against my siding. I should have cut a 45 where those 2 pieces came together, but I forgot, and my piece was already cut, so it'll be alright. Here I'm just kind of marking a level line across so I could put a small piece to cover that last bit of ice and water shield. Again, it's a little funky, but it looks like a finished product, so it's all good. Now I'm going to put the corner trims on. One of these trims you have to cut 3/4 off so that when they come together it's equal on both sides. If I just put these 2 stock trims together on the corner, one edge would be longer than the other edge, so I cut 3/4 off to make up that difference. Now I'm making a little block jig so that I could get these nailed together. It's easier if you have 2 people, but once again, going solo here. Getting creative with these little jigs. now for the satisfying cleanup montage. If you made it this far, I want to thank you for hanging out. If this video has been helpful or entertaining, I would really benefit from you hitting that subscribe button. I do plan on uploading DIY, home improvement, and furniture making videos regularly. In my next video, I'll be building and installing a window. I got that window in the background for like $50, but it's way too small and doesn't fill that space properly. The next size up window is like $250, so I'm going to build a window of my own using 1x and plexiglass. I think the materials for that ended up costing like $80, so it ended up working out pretty good. Thank you all for watching. I appreciate every one of you, and make sure to check out part 6.